Hey, this is Huck. If you want to watch this top three asshole keep doing esports content, subscribe to Thorin's YouTube channel.
The Overwatch League playoffs came and we're down to the final already, and we've had massive upsets, particularly in the semi-finals, where we had the London Spitfire, a team that for the last stage and a half was falling off, barely made it into the playoffs overall, end up beating out the LA Valiant, the team that went undefeated in stage 3, including winning the stage 4, including winning the stage 4 playoffs, one of the better teams for the last half of the Overwatch League. Then you had the Philadelphia Fusion, a team that was good, especially in stage 2. Obviously, people remember, still a solid team, but fell off a bit in the latter stages, came into the playoffs, was actually the lower seed, beat out Boston, got to play against the NYXL, the champion of 2 of the stages, finalist of all of the stages, a team that had barely ever lost games except in stage 4, where most people assumed, because they'd already locked up a playoff spot and eventually the number 1 seed for the playoffs, that they weren't trying, they weren't showing off all their tactics, they weren't playing a standard meta and showing people basically what their style of play was. So these 2 massive upsets, both quite unlikely, both at the same time. Now, we're going to look at the format that these playoffs used. So the format was only 6 teams made the playoffs. And because you've got 6 teams, logically to be able to make a bracket, you can't just have 3 best of 3s because then one team's not going to have anyone to play. So what you do is you have a format. It's actually similar to a format we have in some other games where the lower seeds play against each other in what would have been a quarterfinals match, but you can call now a round of 6 match. Except obviously 2 of the teams have skipped with buys. And then the 2 teams that skip with the buys, the 2 top seeds, wait in the semi-finals for the winners of those first 2 matches. There was even a little wrinkle in this, which unlike, for example, in CS, where we have that kind of playoff format at the ESL and IEM events, in Overwatch League, there was reseeding after the round of 6. So that, for example, if Boston had won their match against Philadelphia Fusion, it would have actually been Boston playing against the LA Valiant, because the LA Valiant were the number 2 seed for the playoffs. Whereas if Fusion wins against Boston, as they did, they would be the lowest seed overall going forwards, because both Gladiators and Spitfire are ahead of them, and therefore Fusion had to go against the number 1 seed NYXL. I actually like that. It's a system that you don't tend to have overall in many other leagues, except notably LCS and LPL in League of Legends. But aside from that, a lot of other formats that use the skip to the semi-finals don't have that. I think it's a positive. I think it makes up for upsets and doesn't just let you ride someone else's seed through the playoffs, which I've never been a fan of in things like the NBA, and hence why I was very sad actually when the NHL a few years back changed so they took away their reseeding. Now, one of the things that immediately came to mind for me when I saw these 2 big favourites, Valiant and NYXL, both losing the semis while they were just sat there, is that obviously I hadn't seen them play in ages, because they didn't play in the first round of the playoffs. They hadn't played since the end of stage 4. And so you think to yourself, why have they lost? What are the factors? And it reminded me of something that happened in Counter-Strike quite often, where I wrote an article about this. You can look below. It was done last year, where in Counter-Strike history, whenever we had tournament formats like this, where if you win your group, or in this case a league, you get to skip to the semi-finals while the other teams that make the playoffs play in the round before you, it was found that we actually had a curse. So in CS 1.6, there were 3 big majors that did this, the IM World Championship, and obviously as a result, 3 of them. So you had 6 teams that were sat in the semi-finals, and not a single one of these 6 teams won the tournament, or even worse, won that semi-final match and went to the final. Despite the fact it should be an advantage to win the group and then get to skip and then not have to play a first-round matchup so you can't get eliminated there, watch the team playing that. You'd think of all these positives. It never worked out for them, never even made the final. Then when CSGO came along, initially I noticed the same trend. The team that made the semis never won the tournament. Now, it happened that we eventually got teams who made the finals, and eventually, after a bunch of attempts, we did have teams come forwards and start to win the tournament and make the finals more often. And in fact, now in CSGO, the numbers are way more reasonable. Like, whereas before it was like 100%, 90% that you didn't win the tournament and you didn't even make the final, now we've gone all the way down, including 1.6 and CSGO up to now, to, okay, a lot of teams still don't win the tournament. Obviously, only one of the 2 can. But losing in the semis happens way less often. That's dropped from something like, I think it's dropped to like 50% now instead of like 80% now. So way, way better. To be fair, part of that could be considered to be due to some format changes. In the early days of 1.6 and CSGO, there were actually a lot of tournaments that were doing best of one round robin, and therefore you could win your group sometimes on a tiebreak because you weren't really actually significantly better than the other teams. Hence, it's not necessarily the case that you should win that semi-final. Now we've changed to a format where we actually have best of 3 group stages with double limb leading into the bracket, and hence the teams that skip to the semis generally tend to be the better teams, and therefore they're actually winning more often. So in the most recent tournaments in CSGO, in the last 4, we've actually had something like 5 of the 8 teams, only 5 of the 8 teams failed to get to the finals. And we actually had a crazy period after, funnily enough, I made the article about the curse, where literally 6 out of 6 teams that were in semis made the finals. So it's improved quite a lot. It's not really that big a deal as a curse now. Now, funnily enough, another game that had kind of a trend of skipping not always being positive was actually in League of Legends, but it wasn't the LCS or LPL. It was that in the LCK, which was the best domestic league because it's the Korean league, you didn't skip just with another team to the semis. Everyone skipped based on where they placed in the overall rankings. So the top 5 teams made the playoffs. 5 played 4, but in only a best of 3. The winner of that match played the 3rd seed, who was waiting in the next round in a best of 5. The winner of that played the 2nd seed, who was waiting in the round of 2 or whatever, in a semi-final with a bye for the other person, winner of that one. And then the winner of that played the finalist, who was the number 1 seed, and they just sat in the final while 3 other games took place. Now, generally, the team that was in the final did win. I mean, they were the best team in the regular season. They were the best team overall. You play a best of 5. Koreans are amazing with prep. So I think actually the Korean prep aspect compared to Counter-Strike, which is all Western teams generally playing, might have played a difference. But I also think that if you go and look at a lot of those finals, first of all, there were some that were lost, a couple of them, notably by the Rocks Tigers core, and also some of them that were won well, the ones that were lost actually were won by the greatest team of all time, SK Telecom. But more importantly, there were a number of those finals that were a lot closer than people anticipated because the team skipped to the final. Therefore, they hadn't played any matches in the playoffs yet. They hadn't had a chance to make any adaptations or figure out who they're going to sub in or out or what they're going to do in the current meta, which might have been different from what they earned their number 1 seed for in the body of the regular season. So in League of Legends, it was generally much better. Now, this kind of a format, the positives of it actually are worth discussing. So one of the reasons it was created in CS 1.6 by Carmack from ESL for the Intel Extreme Masters Tour, obviously he didn't create the format overall, but for esports specifically, was because he wanted the media, because he himself used to be a journalist, to have more time to craft narratives. And obviously for the Overwatch League, that has been a great factor. There's been videos, interviews. People have had a lot of time to break it down on talk shows, shoulder content, the Overwatch League. It's not like in the old days of these IEMs where you'd be playing 2 days later, or in the past before he implemented this system, you'd be playing the very next day. And so there wasn't time for people to do a full interview with you, do a full breakdown, watch the demos, discuss things, look at insight, be insightful in the same way as you would for the Super Bowl final or the NBA finals, where you have time between the series. That's a great concept. That's something that definitely can expose esports to a wider audience, make people who already want to watch the match become more engaged, more interested, become bigger fans of the teams. Also, it's the case that the team who gets to skip a round ahead gets more time to prepare for the next match. They get more time to scout their opponent. Koreans obviously are famously good at that and can do a lot more with it. In League of Legends, it's infamous that if you get that the difference between the Koreans in the group stage of the World Championship, when everyone's playing at the same time, they can get upset there. When they get to the playoffs, there's only ever one time that a Korean team ever lost a best of 5 series at the World Championship. That's how much better they get when you give them like a week to prep and the better format. Then you've got to consider that when you skip ahead, because you're not playing, you can actually sit and watch the other team play. So not only can you watch them playing as much as you scouting them live, because you're not playing a match at the same time, But also, they have one less match of you to watch. They don't have a match from you in the quarterfinals, or what would have been the quarterfinals if there wasn't a bye. They don't have any data to go off except what happened in the group, so you have a little bit of an information advantage. Also, theoretically, because it skips you forwards a few days, or in this case, a week or two, it actually means, in theory, you can cool off some of the hot streaks. Say someone was actually not a very good team, but they narrowly crept into the playoffs. Then they had an amazing round of 6 match. Maybe because it's a week later, a few days later, they're actually not on fire anymore, and they come back down to whatever their normal level is based on prep and skill level and the meta of the game. And maybe they're not as good, and so since you're the favourite, you win out anyway, no matter how good they would have been. Whereas if you'd have played them the very next day, maybe they'd still be riding that hot streak. Okay, you could kind of gauge that as a potential positive. The problem is some of the negatives, I think, help more reasonably account for why the semis seems to have this weird curse, even though you'd think with the teams earning their spot there due to seeding, they should be winning, 70, 80, 90% of the time in that match because they're the big favourites. And in fact, in Overwatch League, you had one of the most sturdy, durable formats where you play each match is a best of 5, and then each match has a best of 3 of those best of 5s. Each series is 3 best of 5s potentially, or best of 3. So if you win 2 of them, you win obviously, but otherwise you have to play 3. That should make it even less likely that you have upsets, which makes me think some of these negatives are coming into play more. Because first of all, by skipping, yes, even though in theory you can prep more and you could even practice more in theory, it often leaves you without as much practice though. Because in this scenario, first of all, you can't prep against the teams that are already in the playoffs because they might have to play you, or you have to play the one who's going to be on the other side of the bracket, which actually with reseeding is more tricky, or you're in a scenario where all the other teams in the league are out of the league. You have to hope that one of them stays at the tournament or stays around and that they're even in any kind of good shape still when they have nothing left to play for. So you're sat there sometimes getting bad practice, not practicing. Meanwhile, they are essentially playing a really good form of practice, which is a real match for their tournament life, where they're bringing out their best, they're trying their hardest, their opponent's trying their hardest in the current meta to beat them, and so they get better practice overall because they get a real match. Now, you got to add in as well, in games like League of Legends and Overwatch, the meta shift from patch to patch can be drastic or significant in terms of how it shifts the balance of a player or a team's style. And so if you have no official experience from a real match in the new meta, you might not have the right feedback. You might not have the right read on the meta. You get less real feedback for actually losing a real match, as opposed to just playing in scrims where it's always tough to tell based on wins or losses as to whether it's working. You have to kind of get a feel for whether it's the case. Finally, because you haven't played any matches before you play this semi-finals match, you can't make any adjustments based on what would have happened in your quarterfinals match. You can't make subs. Oh, that didn't really work out there. This matchup wasn't working well. This comp wasn't working well, actually, so we'll swap that out. You're coming in with just what you've done in prep, and you have to present it now. The team you're playing has already tested stuff out in the other match. They've tested it out against a different opponent. Then they've prepped, and now they've come in to play you overall. So I actually think even the advantage that you got from CS of like, oh, you could prep more, they have to play more. Well, the week means that you don't really. They just get the advantage of having played, and they still get time to prep as well. So personally, while I don't think it's a curse in the same sense as it was in Counter-Strike, and even in Counter-Strike the numbers have gone down, even though they're still a little bit unexpectedly high, it's the case that I think it's just not that great a format generally. And here's why. I would prefer, if you're going to do a single elim bracket like that, especially with such a sturdy format where it's so unlikely that the number 1 seed is going to lose to the last place team, I think that actually everyone who makes it to the finals should have played the same amount of matches. Because if you're the number 1 seed in the regular season, then if you seed the playoff bracket for an 8-team bracket, as you would in a traditional sport, number 1 seed will play the number 8 seed, the worst team to make the playoffs. Number 2 seed will play the number 7 seed, and they'll be on opposite sides of the bracket, obviously. That's a great enough reward as is. You're very highly favoured to win that matchup. You're a much better team based on the season. They've probably just crept into the playoffs. They probably are intimidated by the fact that you're the number 1 seed. It's a very sturdy format in NBA and NHL. It's a best of 7. Here, it's best of 5s and a best of 3. It's unlikely you're going to lose. So as a result, you get warmed up, you get to get a match to test things in, other teams get to see you, but you get to see them an equal amount, you each have an equal amount of practice and official play. I think it evens the playing field and makes it so there's no weird trends like this. Also, because you're very likely to win that match, it means that when a great team goes on a run all the way through the playoffs and wins the playoffs, you get more classic matches from a successful championship run of a potentially all-time great team. Think if you're an NBA fan of when the Golden State Warriors have won these last few NBA NBA titles, or in the 90s, that Michael Jordan's Bulls. If they just skipped around in the playoffs, you wouldn't get to see some of those crazy games they have in the first round where the star player scores 40, or they have an amazing comeback, or they just crush a team, and you see that that's what their style looks like when it's at their absolute peak, because they're playing a bad seed who perhaps doesn't even match up with them well in terms of style or star players. If they just skip, you miss some great performances, you miss the potential for an epic upset that's unlikely, but will be very memorable. So obviously you can think of, I mean, a classic example in the NBA would be back in 1994, the Nuggets under George Karl, the Nuggets were able to beat George Karl's Sonics, who were the number 1 seed. Admittedly, it was best of 5 back then. Then in 2007, the number 1 ranked team in the NBA were the Dallas Mavericks, and they lost famously to a different Golden State Warriors team, the one that had Baron Davis and Steven Jackson and was shooting threes and playing small ball before it was cool. Then in the NHL, obviously in 2012, you had the LA Kings win the entire NHL, coming in as a number 8 seed and having to, with reseeding, beat all the top seeds, including the number 1 seed in the first round of the playoffs. It made it even more epic, and in that case, made it even more special that they won, because they won one of the hardest paths of all time. So what a great team, even though in the regular season they hadn't been great, because actually they'd done a trade towards the end. So I wouldn't say that Overwatch is like definitely get affected by this. I think the playoff format is sturdy enough. It probably won't happen as often in future, but it certainly was worrying here. It was a little bit ominous, and especially when you consider some of the history in other esports games. And I think generally, when you've got such a long calendar circuit, you've also got so much time between the stages. You've got patch changes between the stages. I think it would make more sense for everyone to eliminate any weirdness in this sense by just having every playoff team play a first round match, then a semi-final match, then a final. So I hope in the future with expansion, we can have the 8 teams in the playoffs, and then we don't have this aspect, and we get more great games as well. This video was kindly supported by Dean Tanglis, Gardner Wilson, Andreas Snazore Westerlund, Alex Adams, Daniel Yordanov, TTMXMP, VeXii, HawpT, Robert Baxter, and Travis Greb, with a special thanks going out to Jerky's Minion. Want teasers for my upcoming content? To ask a question for my monthly AMA? How about taking part in a discussion with me about esports? Or perhaps you want to suggest a topic or a guest for my content? Become a part of the Scrilluminati today at the Patreon link in the description box below.